Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast, and just as I am continuing First Age Friday with the Lay of Lathian, the overwhelming feedback from the Content Council was for me to continue working my way through the story of Aldarion and Erendis. So let's wrap up week 42 with another Second Age Saturday. And we'll pick up where we left off last week as Aldarion and Erendis were finally engaged after only 58 years of waiting around. We wrapped up with this. Thus there was for a time peace and joy in Armenelos, in the house of the king, and in all the isle, and it is recorded in ancient books that there was great fruitfulness in the golden summer of that year, which was the 858th of the Second Age. And now we continue. But alone among the people, the mariners of the Guild of Venturers were not well content. For 15 years Aldarion had remained in Numenor and led no expedition abroad. And though there were gallant captains who had been trained by him, without the wealth and authority of the king's son, their voyages were fewer and more brief, and went but seldom further than the land of Gilgalad. Moreover, timber was become scarce in the shipyards, for Aldarion neglected the forests, and the venturers besought him to turn again to this work. At their prayer, Aldarion did so, and at first Erendis would go about with him in the woods, but she was saddened by the sight of trees felled in their prime, and afterwards hewn and sawn. Soon therefore Aldarion went alone, and they were less in company. Now the year came in which all looked for the marriage of the king's heir, for it was not the custom that betrothal should last much longer than 3 years. One morning in that spring, Aldarion rode up from the haven of Andunier to take the road to the house of Beregar, for there he was to be guest, and thither Erendis had preceded him, going from Armenelos by the roads of the land. As he came to the top of the great bluff that stood out from the land and sheltered the haven from the north, he turned and looked back over the sea. A west wind was blowing, as often at that season, beloved by those who had a mind to sail to Middle-earth, and white-crested waves marched towards the shore. Then, suddenly, the sea-longing took him as though a great hand had been laid on his throat, and his heart hammered, and his breath was stopped. He strove for the mastery, and at length turned his back and continued on his journey, and by design he took his way through the wood where he had seen Erendis riding as one of the Eldar, now 15 years gone. Almost he looked to see her so once more, but she was not there, and desire to see her face again hastened him, so that he came to Beregar's house before evening. There she welcomed him gladly, and he was merry, but he said nothing touching their wedding, though all had thought that this was a part of his errand to the Westlands. As the days passed, Erendis marked that he now often fell silent in company when others were gay, and if she looked towards him suddenly, she saw his eyes upon her. Then her heart was shaken, for the blue eyes of Aldarion seemed to her now gray and cold, yet she perceived, as it were, a hunger in his gaze. That look she had seen too often before, and feared what it boded, but she said nothing. At that, Nuneth, who marked all that passed, was glad, for words may open wounds, as she said. Ere long, Aldarion and Erendis rode away, returning to Armenelos, and as they drew further from the sea, he grew merrier again. Still, he said nothing to her of his trouble, for indeed he was at war within himself, and irresolute. So the year drew on, and Aldarion spoke neither of the sea nor of wedding, but he was often in Romenna, and in the company of the venturers. At length, when the next year came in, the king called him to his chamber, and they were at ease together, and the love they bore one another was no longer clouded. "My son," said Tarmanelder, "when will you give me the daughter that I have so long desired? More than 3 years have now passed, and that is long enough. I marvel that you could endure so long a delay." Then Aldarion was silent, but at length he said, "It has come upon me again, Atarinya. 18 years is a long fast. I can scarce lie still in a bed, or hold myself upon a horse, and the hard ground of stone wounds my feet." Then Meneldur was grieved, and pitied his son, but he did not understand his trouble, for he himself had never loved ships, and he said, "Alas, but you are betrothed. and by the laws of Numenor and the right ways of the Eldar and Edain, a man shall not have two wives. You cannot wed the sea, for you are affianced to Erendis. And we'll end it there for today. Now we start out in a time of peace and joy in the capital city of Numenor. The king's heir and Erendis are betrothed in Second Age 858, and there was much rejoicing. But not for his buddies in the Guild of Venturers. His last voyage had ended in 843, 15 years ago, and they're chomping at the bit to get back out there. Not just because they wanted adventure and loot, but because they wanted to bring back more timber for boats. Aldarion has been ignoring his job as the master of the forests. Now, in a small but telling moment, we see that when he does take up this responsibility again, Erendis simply can't bear to be with him, watching as trees are felled and cut. Seems to me to be an echo of Tolkien's own deep love for trees that we see here. Now, Aldarion continues to take his sweet time to actually marry Erendis, and sure enough, the longing for the sea strikes again. It's a powerful drive for him, and yet, for now at least, he fights it successfully. A moment of hope, albeit too brief, as we'll see. Now, stunningly, when he shows up at the house of Erendis' father, he doesn't even mention the wedding. He appears distant, but she knows what this look means, and she fears what's coming next. But she doesn't talk to him about it, and he doesn't talk to her about it. Can I just point out that the lack of clear communication is a problem here, and we will see that repeated throughout? Finally, the king, who we are told has been fully reconciled to his son. I love that. They were at ease together, and the love they bore one another was no longer clouded. He risks it all by gently asking Aldarion, when is he going to go ahead and get married? All right, you're engaged now. When's the wedding? That's when the king's heir finally confesses his desire for the sea and is chided rightly, gently but rightly, by his father. Man, this heartbreaking story is unfolding bit by bit, and even for those of you who've never read it and who don't know the ending, I fear that at least some of it is becoming clearer with every reading. For now, though, that does it for this week's Second Age Saturday. Thank you for joining me. Please be sure to come back next week as Aldarion and his father's conversation takes a more hostile turn, and the king's heir finally speaks with Erendis about all this before sailing off again. Please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times before you sail off to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, join my content council, get bonus content, and a whole lot more. And please, if you're watching the show on YouTube, like and subscribe. Please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.